And there's a lot to talk about because, of course, it's a really interesting and unique time in Cuba. I had the chance to be part, as Chris said, of a tour focused primarily on organic farms and co-ops and some of the experiments in agroecology that are going on there. And it was organized through a group called the Center for Global Justice, which is based in San Miguel in Mexico. And we had a pretty diverse group, about 10 of us who signed up either through that group or the Organic Consumers Association, which I hope you're all familiar with. And then there was a group of 15 or 20 people from, of all places, South Dakota State University. So you'll see a mix of students and profs, and also our crew, which was mostly in their 50s and 60s. A couple of guys were older, and it's an interesting mix. So just a little bit of background, get everybody up to speed. Folks are aware that Cuba was heavily supported by the Soviet Union in the 60s, 70s, and 80s. When the Soviet Union fell apart in the early 90s, Cuba went through a really difficult period where there were severe food shortages. The average person, somebody told me, lost as much as the average diet, lost a third of its caloric value, and with the lack of petroleum and agricultural inputs of various kinds, they entered into an experiment to create a different kind of agriculture, one rooted in, of course, very old ways of growing food organically, combined with some of the latest methods. And Cuba has something like triple the per capita population of scientists of Latin America as a whole. So a lot of people with a lot of knowledge really put their heads toward trying to create a new agricultural system. And that continues till today, although, as we'll see, there are many problems that have arisen due to a combination of world events and, of course, a year's worth of increased diplomatic contact with the U.S. For example, the week before I was there, and with this group, Tom Vilsack, U.S. Agriculture Secretary, made a trip with a whole group of agribusiness U.S. senators from major agribusiness states. So there's a lot of tension around how to sustain these experiments in the face of international pressure, in the face of some internal pressures. We'll get into some of that. So this is Jose Marti International Airport. This is the terminal where flights from the U.S. come in, which is the old part of the airport. Apparently there's a modern airport on the across the way where flights from Europe and Canada that aren't under the same restrictions that we are. In order to go to Cuba, you still, to fly from the U.S., have to be part of some kind of organized tour with a specific educational purpose. But the plane we flew on, even though we were not only on a charter flight, was an American Airlines plane, which was kind of a surprise. So you see modern European and Japanese cars, but also the famous restored 1950s cars that everybody knows are common in Cuba, and they've developed a lot of technology to keep those cars on the road, and this is just the spur road outside the perimeter of the airport, and you see a lot of those, and we'll see more of them. And this is the vehicle we were traveling in, a funky old school bus that a Canadian pastor had donated to a Cuban school a number of decades ago, now owned by an organization called the Martin Luther King Center in Havana, which provided our guide and our translator. And this is about half of our group. The woman in the middle, her name is Eloisa. She was a top government translator. She translated for Nelson Mandela when he was in Cuba. She translated for the first pope who came to Cuba a number of about a decade ago, and now she's helping people from around the world learn about what's going on. And you see, the most of the older folks you see were part of our circle, and then the students are all from South Dakota. So this is the old part of Havana. We'll just start with just a few slides from our days in Havana, and then we'll get into the farms. This is the old Spanish fortress that goes back to the 16th century, I'm pretty sure, and it's right along the it's right on the coast there, on the north coast, which is where Havana is located, in the northwestern part of the island. Cuba is, of course, long and narrow. It's about 800 miles across, but only a day's drive from north to south. So that's the old Spanish fortress and the old Spanish cathedral. Something you might notice is the two towers are very different from each other. They were built at different times, so they're kind of asymmetrical. And the old Spanish architecture in this part of town is pretty phenomenal. This is the old colonial capital, and the statue is of a Dominican revolutionary who worked with Jose Marti to help liberate Cuba from Spanish control in the 19th century. This is one of the well-known squares in the center of Havana. And here, of course, is the notorious U.S. Embassy, which has always been there as a U.S. kind of headquarters. It was called the U.S.-Cuban intersection or something like that. And just a year ago, or less than a year ago, it was re-established as the U.S. Embassy. And they've tried to, the U.S. government at various times has kind of tried to make it a really highly visible symbol of the U.S. presence and used it to advertise various U.S. things. So right across the courtyard, the Cubans put that up. And this is typical street in a residential part of Havana. The kind of boxy looking cars are actually mostly Russian. And then there are some European and Japanese ones, and not too many of the old American ones on this particular street. One of the things that's striking about over the last decade or so, there's been increasing economic inequality. And you can see really from one block to another, classic old Spanish-style houses that are in beautiful condition, and on the next block, apartment blocks that are really visibly crumbling. They really are having a difficult time. And of course, the 50-year-long, 55-year-long U.S. embargo is a significant part of that. At the same time that the Obama administration is working on restoring diplomatic relations, they're also still suing foreign companies and banks that are violating the U.S. embargo by doing business with Cuba in ways that are outside the realm of what's authorized. This is more tourist-oriented part of town, and a lot of these old cars, the ones that are really painted up, are run as taxis, and I didn't really ask, but I have a feeling people pay a lot of money to ride in those. One of the odd things about Cuba is it's got two currencies. The traditional Cuban peso is currently worth about 4 cents, and then there's a peso that's convertible to international currencies that's pegged to the dollar. And for people who are getting paid in the old Cuban peso, which is the vast majority of people still, it's really a struggle to get by because prices are rising, and what's happening is people are more and more dependent on the tourist economy. So you hear about highly skilled professionals, engineers, physicians making, you know, 20, 30, sometimes $50 equivalent a month, and then needing to supplement their income by participating in the tourist economy in some way, by selling things to tourists, by working as interpreters, translators, guides. And because of that, there's a lot of hustle, including you know, people who fix up these old cars just on every corner trying to grab people to take a taxi ride, but it's a lot more than a taxi ride. This is Plaza Vieja, which is still part of the old city. You can see it's just in beautiful shape. It's a mix of most places in Havana that are, you know, within the realm of the tourist economy. There's a mix of Cubans and travelers from all around the world. People from Europe and Canada have never stopped going to Cuba in large numbers. I remember maybe 15 years ago I was on a domestic Canadian flight from Montreal to Toronto, and the whole ticket envelope was trips to Cuba. So for people from Europe, for people from Canada, people go to Cuba to sit in cafes and places like this, and of course also to be by the ocean. And there's a whole resort area to the northeast of Havana where I know a lot of Canadians go, and all along the coast, the whole length of the island, there are places that are significant European enclaves. And in the last year, tourism has gone up something like 30%. And people have this difficult relationship with it. On the one hand, they need the income. On the other hand, it really distorts the economy. It distorts the culture in ways you can imagine, and also in some surprising ways. For example, even with all the urban agriculture, which we'll see some of, that's become established in Havana and other cities over the last 20, 25 years, there's still a significant shortage of fruits and vegetables in Havana. And it's because it's all kind of getting grabbed up by the big resorts, by the privately owned restaurants that have proliferated in the last 10 years or so. And there's music everywhere. It's really, the music in Cuba is so great. And there are people playing music on the street, and there are people playing music in every restaurant and club and little cantina, and out on the beach, of course, near the coast. And it's the analogy that came to mind was with New Orleans. If you've been in New Orleans and know what it's like to be in a city where there's just incredible music everywhere, Havana's really the same way. And this is a park right in Havana, and I was surprised to see banyan trees, which of course are native to India and other parts of South Asia. And of course, like in many places in the tropics, plants that you might grow on your windowsill, just growing in the middle of the woods like this. And then the other thing that maybe you know about Cuba are the billboards, and this is the same park. There's a river that goes through the park, and that's kind of the headquarters of the park. And on the side of it are quotes about the importance of preserving nature from Martí and Fidel Castro, and of course Che Guevara. And the images of especially Fidel and Che are everywhere, but also billboards with quotes from well-known international figures. You see quotes from Gandhi and Mandela, and Victor Hugo is a popular one. He apparently lived there for many decades in Havana. So the political education that happens through signs on the streets and in the parks and various places is something that's still really prominent there. So this is a residential neighborhood in Havana, and there's a fairly large vegetable farm right there in this residential neighborhood. You will get more of a sense of the scope of it in a minute, but it's really a much bigger scale than you would see in an urban neighborhood, certainly anywhere here. The only place I've been where I saw large-scale food growing to this extent in cities were some places in Japan. And this is the same place. Just before we saw the houses and the street and the neighborhood, and this is right there. And a lot of the kinds of practices that we saw demonstrated on a larger scale and some of the larger farms we visited are happening here as well. The flowers planted as trap crops for pests and to attract birds and beneficial insects and butterflies, like many of us who garden here in New England do, but on a much more elaborate scale because it's the tropics and because of the biodiversity that's possible there. Coconut tree, right in that same largish garden plot, small farm right on the edge of the city. And the greenhouse is mostly used, and there's another slide that I don't have here, where you see a canopy, kind of a mesh canopy, and they're mainly used for shade, so that greens that want a cooler climate can grow through the hot Caribbean summer. Banana trees over in that grove there with the coconut palms hovering over them. And this was late November. This was a couple of days the week before Thanksgiving, and through Thanksgiving week is the time when I was there. So it's the beginning of the rainy season, so starting to plant the next season's greens is one thing that's happening. And then right across from there was just a guy selling bunches of greens from that same large garden, small farm. And just for comparison, this is a fruit and vegetable farm in another neighborhood of Havana, to just give you a sense of what's there. The tropical fruit, of course, is amazing, but there are lots of places in Havana where you can't get it. So, we started taking the school bus to interesting places to visit farmers on the outskirts of Havana over the first 5-6 days. And then the last several days, you'll see we traveled further out into the countryside for a change of scene. I don't have this guy's name written down. His farm is called Dos Hermanos. It's him and his brother that founded it just a few years ago. A lot of these farms are on recovered plantation land that was used to grow sugarcane, that was used to grow large-scale citrus. And since the 90s, and at a much more rapid pace over the last 10 years, the government has been giving use rights to people who want to farm to patches of land. And they've given out over the last 15, 20 years, something like 1 million hectares of land. A hectare is 2.5 acres. To something like 100,000 people, I think, is the number. over this period of time. And what he's demonstrating here are the seeds of this tree. I mean, the broad leaves you may recognize as a banana tree, and we'll see a lot more bananas growing in just a bit. But this other tree with the puffy red balls is called bica, and it's used in the Caribbean as a substitute for saffron, for coloring and flavoring rice. And what this man has done is developed a really interesting tropical polyculture where different crops are grown at different levels.
One moment, excuse me. Silver Civic License 8ANBXI, lights are on. Thanks, please continue.
All right. Really interesting tropical polyculture. If any of you are familiar with permaculture practice, you know that a lot of things will grow much better with higher levels of productivity, but also much reduced need for maintenance and for pest control and for cultivation if you're able to simulate the various niches that plants actually occupy in a field or in a grassland or a forest. In the tropics, where you have the rainforest that is living on multiple layers at various altitudes, that creates incredible opportunities if what you're trying to do is grow various kinds of fruits and vegetables on a small plot of land. So these are a couple of his crops, but the next couple of slides, I think, help us understand his methodology a little bit. This is a grove of banana trees, and this is late in the season. So a lot of the canes a lot of the stalks have already been cut down. If you're not familiar with how bananas grow, they grow on a long stalk. And basically the whole tree is cut down at the end of the season and it regrows. So an older banana grove will have plants of many different sizes, and some of these have been harvested many times. And in establishing this farm, he actually planted bananas first and has developed many layers of crops that grow in and around the bananas. So those small shrubs right in the middle of this banana grove are actually coffee seedlings. And this is what coffee grows like.
Oh my goodness.
The red beans are ripe, the green ones obviously aren't yet. So the first 2 stories that he planted were the banana trees with the coffee growing under it. But neither of those are his main crop. His main crop are avocados, and those are much bigger trees that grow around the banana groves. And the avocados there are like that big. And here's some avocados. And then there are the taller trees that grow on top of that. Of course, coconuts, and citrus. There are many, many different kinds of citrus growing there. Ones we're familiar with, and a lot of others as well. And then mangoes. And then towering over everything are what they call the royal palms. And those are massive tall trees. And those palm fronds are the ones that are used for thatching roofs. And we'll see some traditional thatched roofs later on. So it's all about taking advantage of multiple layers in order to grow a very high concentration of food in a relatively small space. I forget how big this farm was, but most of the farms we visited, except for one bigger one, which I'll point out in a bit, more in the range of 10 to 20 hectares again, so that's 25 to 50 acres. And people are doing really impressive things. And there are goats in the understory. And the goats, of course, keep the weeds down and the undergrowth down. I guess they don't like coffee seedlings. So then we rode a little bit further out into the countryside. I think this is the next day, and that's just a view from the road of the tall palm trees and the grassy fields in between. A lot of this land is recovering dairy land. So there were once large-scale dairies in this immediate area. And we visited this guy whose name is Alfonso Wilson. And he's from Peru. And he's lived all over the world. He's lived in Europe. He's studied and worked on farms in West Africa, in South Asia. And he is trying to bring all of that knowledge to his little farm plot, maybe a 45-minute bus ride outside of Havana. And because of that experience and that knowledge and his curiosity to keep experimenting, he's also doing some really impressive things. Until very recently, he was plowing his fields with oxen. But just within, and this farm has only been around for, I think, a couple of years, so it's really still very much under development. Just within the last few weeks, he had bought, with some aid from the government, this old 1950s vintage Ford tractor with a brand new Russian engine. And that's his father, and his parents are there, and there are also a number of field workers who he works with who are pretty old, and these guys were, mostly working in cane plantations before the revolution in Cuba, and now they're working on small farms like his. There's a shortage of farm labor, partly because, in his opinion, in Alfredo's opinion, it's because the educational system is so good that people from the countryside tend to want to be in the cities. And I described how in Vermont we have 3 generations of people who have high levels of education, who have consciously chosen to go back to the land and work on farms. And he was pretty amazed because they don't have anything like that there yet. So his farm workers are all kind of twice his age, and they make it work. And here he's showing, that's I think a small citrus seedling. He's clearing the underbrush with machetes and scythes, and then planting these seedlings and applying a mix of hand cultivation and biological controls to keep the weeds and pests down. And he says the workers are kind of mystified because they all grew up farming with chemicals, and they don't understand why he's going through the extra effort, and as their employer urging them to go through the extra effort of hand cultivation. Chemicals are scarce, but it's also for Alfredo and for a lot of the farmers we visited a matter of principle to not do things that way. So you can see a row of seedlings growing in the underbrush. And a little patch of corn. And I think that's some kind of squash or cucumber around the edges of it. You know, we're used to corn being grown in big fields, but as part of a mixed polyculture, a small plot like that is certainly sufficient. Unlike the farms that we'll see in a bit that are mostly selling to institutions and the cities, he's really committed to supporting and being part of a local economy in his state. He says, I don't want to sell to Havana, I don't want to sell to tourists, I don't want to sell to these privately owned restaurants. He keeps his crops close to home, and he's developed exchange relationships with other farmers and institutions right in the area where he lives in order to create a more self-reliant model. And here, I don't remember what's growing here, but you know, again, you see the annual crops and the perennial tree crops kind of hovering over them. And this is something you see everywhere in Cuba. They call it yuca. It's basically cassava or manioc. It's a starchy root. It's kind of a dietary staple. It's not quite as nutritious as potatoes, say, but it just grows really prolifically in the tropics, and you see it everywhere. At this farm, they served it with this incredible sour orange garlic sauce that just made it taste incredible. And they're also raising pigs. And they've tried Canadian pigs, and they were fussy eaters, and these pigs are from China, and he said they'll eat anything. Just another 10 or 15 minutes further west, we went to this farm, and the farmer is over here. His name is Fernando Funes. And he's a really well-known person in Cuba. He worked as an agricultural researcher for many years. He's written articles. If you saw the readings that I sent to Chris to distribute around, he's the co-author of one of the articles with Miguel Altieri, the founder of agroecology, who teaches at UC Berkeley. He travels all over the world talking about the Cuban model of alternative agriculture, but he's kind of gotten tired of that, and now that he's really focusing on building up his farm, which has been around for I think 7 or 8 years. And because he's pretty well connected, he's been able to do a lot of things that most people are unable to. I mean, some of the more modest farms, like where we just were before this, they're able to get supplies really cheap through the government, you know, piping for irrigation and parts for the tractor and all these kinds of things. They can get stuff for maybe 1/10 of the market rate, but it takes time. So if you have access, you can do a lot more, a lot faster. And he started off by telling us the story of this well. This is a water well that he built when they first moved to this farm. And it took something like a year digging through bedrock to actually get to water. But now they have plenty of water. And that's what it looks like inside. There's ferns growing all along the edges. I forget how deep it is, but it's a year's worth of digging through bedrock deep. And his gardens are gorgeous. They've got these raised beds that are built with stone and cement, and incredible rotations, and again, mix of vegetables and the upper story of coconuts and bananas and other fruits. He is growing greens primarily for a mix of institutions like schools and hospitals, and also selling to big restaurants and resorts and stuff. And obviously, in that economy, the means to do more elaborate things become available because it means access to those precious convertible pesos. And here's a row of fennel and salad greens and other herbs. And it's just a gorgeous place. He's a little worried though, because not far from where he lives, maybe 20 kilometers further west, there's a deep water port that's being improved, and there's talk about it becoming one of these export processing zones, and if various corporations have their way, it'll end up being like the maquila zones that we read about in other places in Latin America. His goal is to organize the farmers in his area to create kind of an eco-buffer to protect the local agriculture from that intrusion. But we left there a little concerned about to what extent he's going to be able to stand up to that kind of economic pressure and the kind of pollution that comes from that scale of development. So it's an example of the pressures that people under. Fernando was also once the highest profile GMO opponent in Cuba. You may know that there are some distinct varieties of, for example, GMO insecticidal crops that have been developed by the Cuban research institutes that are targeted at pest species that they're concerned about in Cuba. Of course, it's not Monsanto, and they're not patented. There isn't that level of political problems, but the whole host of ecological and potential health issues with GMOs are something that he spent many years raising. A couple of years ago, the three agencies that have to do those kinds of approvals all approve these varieties, and at that point that contributed to his decision to kind of get out of the research end of things and get out of a lot of traveling and focus in on his farm where he feels he can make the most difference. But some of us left there wondering how some of the other people who are presumably continuing to challenge the use of GMOs in Cuba feel about losing really their highest profile ally. That's his barn. He has cows, which I don't think are in any of these photos, but that's the barn where he feeds and milks his cows. And there's a methane system. This is an underground tank, actually, that gets the effluent from the barn. It's anaerobic, so it generates a lot of methane, and he says he can generate enough methane to cook for 20 people a day, and he's eventually going to trying to build some kind of an electrical plant. And then there are the solids run down into those pits that are part of his composting system. And everybody's got really impressive composting systems. Some of the farms we visited have these beds of worms, and they use, if you've seen worm composting here, they use those same red worms from California that we use here, but they've got troughs like 70 feet long where they're making worm compost to fertilize their farms. And that's just a living fence. And yes, this is another place. This is about an hour or 45 minutes east of Havana, and this was on our trip on our way out of the city for the last few days. And this is in a suburb of Havana called Alamar, and this farm was established many years ago and has really been both a major source of produce for the city and also an important experimental station where there are scientists working on perfecting, again, compost methods, biological pest controls, companion plants, various ways of working with insect biology in order to keep organisms under control that would normally be seen as pests. Here you see a greenhouse that's covered with black mesh as a source of shade. Here, of course, we use greenhouses to try to stretch our growing season a little bit when it gets cold. There, they have to stretch the season because it's too hot, and they use black mesh over their greenhouse. And this is Alamar still, some of their herb beds, aloe vera you recognize, and various herbs growing in rows. But then the overstory are their fruit crops. And also, they're growing a lot of their own biological pest controls. Some of you are familiar with neem that comes from India. They have neem trees that they harvest for its insecticidal oil. It's a bed of beet greens. And this is, of course, on a significantly larger scale than the first 3 farms that you saw. This is organized as a co-op. It's a worker co-op. People who work there become members. The longer you work there, the more shares you have. Everybody has an equal say in basic decisions about managing the farm. And then people get a share of the profits at the end of the year based on how long they've been working there. A lot of the other farms are not organized themselves as co-ops, but they do their marketing through co-ops. They have a whole network of basically farmer-run marketing co-ops, and we visited the headquarters of one of them on the outskirts of Havana. This is a really interesting tree. You see the long pods. This is called moringa. It's from Africa, I think West Africa. And you split open these pods, and the seeds are about 1/8 of an inch in diameter, spherical, and you put it in your mouth, and the first taste is really bitter. And then in about 2 minutes, your mouth gets filled with the sweetest sensation you can ever imagine. And everything you taste, from a glass of water to food to anything, for like the next half hour tastes incredibly sweet. And somebody told me just the other day that somebody here in the US is actually packaging these seeds into tablets that you can buy online, which definitely weirded me out. I'd never heard of anything like that before experiencing the real thing in Alamar. And this is their shrine. Some of the workers there are adherents of the Santeria religion, which is the Cuban version of what people have inherited from their African roots. There's a pretty high proportion of African descended people in Cuba, many who can trace their families back to, of course, slavery times and the huge sugar plantations. And some of the herbs they grow are specifically for ceremonial purposes. So then we took the bus out about 3 or 4 hours east of Havana on the south shore to a region adjacent to their big national park, which is called the Ciénaga Zapata, and it's a protected area with incredible biodiversity. We really just traveled around the outskirts of the park. We didn't really get into it, but we did visit some of the villages and a few farms in the immediate outskirts of the Cienega. And this is just a, typical rural village. Of course, lots of horses. And we visited this apiary. These beehives are actually not for producing honey. They're for producing queen bees that are then sold to other farms in other places. And these are some of the flowers that the bees fly around and pollinate. Just amazing flowers everywhere, including right in the city. And most of the buildings have not slate roofs, have, tar paper roofs or aluminum roofs, but there are definitely a significant number of buildings with the traditional thatch roofs, and the thatch comes from those huge royal palms that we saw a bit ago. And a lot of horse carts, even along the main highway. There's a 6-lane highway that runs the whole length of the country. And on the outer lane, there's horse carts, there's bicycle carts, there's people walking, there's everything. And then a lot of, trucks and a lot of tour buses, much fancier tour buses than what we were traveling in. And it's just amazing being in the tropical forest. I've not been in the tropics all that much, so just every moment in the tropical forest is really a treat. And the beach that we were staying near is called Playa Larga, and the next beach over is Playa Giron, which is where the Bay of Pigs invasion happened in 1961, when U.S. Trained mercenaries who'd been trained by the CIA in Guatemala tried to stage an invasion of Cuba. And this is where it happened, and there's a museum highlighting the successful resistance to the attempted U.S. invasion. And this is where we stayed, about a block from the beach, near Playa Larga. These are basically private houses that have been converted to guest houses. This particular home, there was a family with 2 daughters, and 2 of the rooms were set up as guest rooms. And we kind of all split up among several of these houses, and then some of the ones along the beach were sort of larger hostels where people stayed. And there's the sea. And a typical late afternoon, local folks are out fishing. And here's the end of the day, and the sun setting over the tropics. And I think that's it. Yeah. I think that's it. Thank you.